Hello and welcome to the Creativity Conference podcast. Today I am joined by explorer and fine artist Toby Wright, who is based in Monaco. And if there are any episodes that you should watch of this podcast on YouTube rather than Spotify, this is one of them, because as you can see behind Toby is an amazing collection of some of his work, and I highly recommend that you check him out. Toby, it's so great to have you here. How are you doing?
Yeah, good to see you too, Aidan. Very well. And it was really nice to have been invited also to speak to at the Creativity Conference it was last month, wasn't it? October.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for contributing towards that. I managed to listen to your whole session because there were no active fires being needing put out. Did you manage to attend any other sessions? Did you learn any tidbits from other speakers?
Well, I joined the panel later and interacted with a couple of artists there. But I wish I'd had the time to go and see some of the other ones. But the discussion panel was really interesting later. I found it actually quite interesting because it challenged some of the views that I had taken for granted for some of the subjects that we're talking about. And it doesn't happen often enough to have your viewpoint challenged by an artist from a different background. So I found that really interesting.
That's what it's all about. It's all about removing blinkers and blinders and preconceptions about your field, whatever it may be. In your case, fine art. And if we'd had maybe more time with you, we might have gotten you to do a one-to-one interview with someone from a completely different creative background, because those are often some of the most interesting conversations that take place.
Yeah, I find that often enough there's enough crossover to find common ground, but then you find each person sort of splitting away in their respective specialty, which becomes very particular to that particular person. But I always find that there's enough common ground for people to find a good exchange, and then you just kind of learn of why it is they go off on that particular path.
Yeah, and even when we get people under a roof, someone might be a poet, the other person might be a choreographer, or we'll have a filmmaker and an author. There's always creative fundamentals that reign supreme, that that carry over regardless of the individual field. And once those are found out and talked about, they're off to the races.
I did a project of doing portraits of various artists in Monaco a few years ago, from the ballet, from the orchestra. But what I found the most interesting was when I was talking about the process, the creative process, I suppose you would call it. What was interesting is that we were all almost using the same words, but obviously for a completely different mode of expression. And we found a lot of common ground because I'm classically trained, which obviously requires quite a lot of academic, repetitive exercises to sort of get your craft under control. And so does a dancer, obviously, and so does a musician for an orchestra. And so the crossover there I found was the appreciation and the understanding of how important the process is of learning, the actual journey, not so much the result, but the actual diligent steps that you have to take to sort of get your craft under control before you can even allow yourself to be creative or to be expressive. That was particularly interesting.
And when you're painting people from all these different backgrounds and doing their portraits, there's a sense of responsibility with capturing sort of the essence of the person as well as just their physical likeness.
Yeah.
How do you deal with the responsibility of capturing someone's essence and their character as well as just what they look like?
To be honest, I actually like to demythologize the process and demythologize the artistry, because I feel that it does a great disservice to students who wish to engage in that world, engage in that career, and they think it's not for them because you've got to be a 1 in a million genius to be able to do it. As long as you have the person in the room, because I work from a live model, I don't take a photograph and then work from that. I find that takes away a lot of life, and I don't have the opportunity to move around and just to see all the different little choices that I can take. So by having a live person in the studio, you just naturally have to absorb them through interacting with them. But the aspect of making someone really come alive and feel real to the audience. I boiled it down to some friends of mine once. They were asking me, "Oh, so how did that last portrait commission go?" And I said, "Oh, well, yeah, I did this portrait commission for someone, and when it was done, the family looked at it, or they said, "Oh, it's wonderful. I don't know how you do it, but you've captured their entire life. You've captured their entire being and their soul." So in front of the client, I'll say, that's what I do. But to my friends, I explain to them, that half of what the audience sees is what they project onto it. The half of the work I do, look, I just put the eyes in the right place, the nose in the right place, I put the mouth in the right place, and you did the rest. You recognized your husband, and then you load onto it all the experiences you have for that particular face. So obviously, the accuracy of placing those features is the essential part of doing a portrait. Making it atmospheric, making the edges soft, orchestrating all the lines so that it's a pleasant experience to look at. But ultimately, look, I just put the nose and the eyes in the right place, and that's it.
How do you know when it's done? How do you know when to put the final brushstroke in and say, good to go?
You just give up. Just can't do it anymore. With experience, you know more and more and more. You know where you want to take it. But after a while, you have to. If it's a commission, there's a lot of pressure on it. If it's a personal project, you can say, "Oh well, I can work on that a little bit more tomorrow. I can fix that maybe next week." But the pressure is almost better because it focuses you and makes you work in a very different mindset, in which you just have to get things done, and you get into a different zone, and you're done when you're on the verge of feeling like I'm going to overdo this. And sometimes you do overdo it, and then you just overdo it just enough to know, like, oh, yeah, okay, stop. Sometimes it's just knowing, like, oh, I'll end it when I've put the little highlight in the eye. Bing, okay, done. It's not as mysterious as people think, but every single painting you end up feeling like, I see plenty of my painting and I think, yeah, I could have just pushed that one a little bit more.
Do you go in with ones that you've done, years previously and just go, I'm just going to fix that little thing?
I feel really uncomfortable doing that, actually. Because of the fact I always work from life, I always feel that if I'm not working from life, I'm doing a sort of a hack job, really, of not being able to actually see the original object in front of me. What I will do is soften things. If things are too busy and too distracting, then I can either glaze, soften things up, soften things down, rather. But if it's a matter of making something pop out more and give something more structure, I find it really difficult to do that without going back on site if it's a mountain, or having the person back in the studio to work out a feature.
Does that approach change when you're doing self-portraiture?
Yeah, I've done a few self-portraits. That was usually the joke we always had at school. The only reason you do a self-portrait is to basically practice painting flesh tones and practice doing portraits without having to pay a model. Outsiders always say, like, God, these artists must be such narcissists. They're always painting themselves. But that's actually just a result of not having, just being a cheap student. Saying, right, I need to practice flesh painting and portraiture, just use myself. And it's great because you just get to scrape things down, repaint it, scrape it down, and practice loads. And there's no pressure and there's no loss. And you sort of develop a range of knowing how to dress someone up, how to set up lighting, how to create mood, without the pressures of having someone there, paying them by the hour, them turning up late, not being reliable. So yeah, self-portrait is quite a functional process, not so much an egotistical pursuit.
Well, and another thing that you've been known to do is go to natural history museums, which is another free option of painting things. What makes them such good fodder?
Well, natural history museums it's sort of where I started drawing, I think. As a kid, I would be going to the Oceanographic Museum here. It might be a mix of just finding calmness and contemplation in these museums, but also just the array of shapes. I haven't been to a natural museum for a long time, I think. Last time I was doing that was in my early 20s when I was at university in England. probably over the past 10 years that I've reconnected with this interest in natural history and the way that art, visual arts, have contributed to natural history over a couple of centuries, with different painters and sculptors collaborating to create educational setups, dioramas, to educate the public, just like animal documentaries do today. And it's sort of a nice thing to do on my time off. Just go and just doodle away little beetles and fossils and things.
Yeah, it must be almost meditative to be in such a calming place, amidst maybe some crying children in the background.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. Always avoid weekends.
Yes, and I think more so than a lot of other creative industries, fine art is you find yourself frequently in extended periods of complete isolation and silence, and it's
Right.
you're in sort of you're in the zone, you're painting away. Is this a skill that you had to learn over time, and do you use meditation outside painting in just your day-to-day life?
Interesting, because I know people who meditate. I don't know any artists who meditate in my entourage, and I've so often heard people describe the practice of drawing and painting as meditative from the outside, just observing someone sitting for 3 hours engrossed in one particular activity is akin to meditation in a way. So I don't really find the need to meditate outside of my practice, because I think the immersion that I find myself in sometimes is such that I just sort of lose myself. I don't meditate on any particular thoughts. I meditate on my subject and what I'm doing, and meditate on how bad my colors are looking and how badly I've just drawn that tree, and meditate on why I should have trained longer and I should have practiced better. Maybe that's sort of good introspective self-therapy or something.
Yeah.
But it is. I remember a quote that Churchill wrote, because Churchill was a painter and pretty decent. Did some nice landscapes. Blessed is the painter, for he will never feel lonely. And he made sure that it wasn't he will never be alone, because you are always alone when you're painting or drawing most of the time. But he will never feel lonely, and that's something that I discuss with students who come, or people that are interested in the craft. Is that some people say, "Oh gosh, you must be so patient," and the other observation is people who work in offices. They say, "Oh, don't you feel lonely out there? There's no one around you." I was like, "It's great. When I'm working, I'd rather be alone, but I don't feel lonely. There's nothing about it that makes you feel lonely." And with painting up in the mountains, I could never even compare the presence I have standing next to a 3,000 meter peak or 4,000 meter mass of rock. You can't compare that kind of presence to the biggest crowd at a concert that you could imagine. It's something that is so primeval, and so I strive to be in that sort of situation. It's so inspiring.
And you describe yourself as an explorer, which and you're part of the Explorers Club, and you do actual exploring, which is it's a level beyond just traveling somewhere, right? Where does that line get crossed, and what are you seeking to discover when you're exploring that you wouldn't get just traveling somewhere?
So the term explorer today is pretty is almost redundant, as we've explored most things. But it's inspired by the explorers who came before us and who did such great pioneering work. I'm connected with the Explorers Club as a painter and someone who's sort of pushing the boundaries of how to engage with painting, and the connecting of it with science as well. Until 2015, I was mostly just concentrating on portraits, landscape, narrative paintings of my own, still lifes. But 2015, I was invited to join a group of photographers, scientists, and a couple of other artists to go to the Arctic. And it was a image-making expedition for photographers, painters. There were about 60 of us in total. And this sort of opened up a whole new avenue for me. I was painting in these extreme elements. I was painting outdoors, painting on the glaciers, painting in the different fjords, painting from the boat, painting from land. And just meeting those people as well was fascinating. It opened up a whole new world of seeing how image making can be applied not just for decoration and doing pretty stuff, but having it join a function, a purpose beyond just making a pretty picture, but rather to inspire people, entice people into a subject, get them interested into a particular cause. In this particular case, it was being aware of how climate is affecting the polar regions and how the polar regions obviously determining the weather on the planet and the whole climate. And since then, I've been interacting with a lot of these people, some of them getting sort of privileged access or early access to other small trips where we got to interact with wildlife on in a very intimate way, whether it was swimming with orca up in the Arctic seas of Norway, or going off to the Sea of Cortez and interacting with whale sharks or sea lions. And I realized that I should not just engage in these trips as a sort of a tourist and just passively experiencing these wonderful experiences, but see how I can apply my drawing and painting skills to this. I came up with a system of being able to draw underwater and capture the movements and the impressions of these animals underwater, and then expanding those studies back at the studio in a larger painting to sort of capture the entire experience.
For those who missed Toby's session in October, he discusses this in more detail and shows some of the final products of this, which are stunning. Right. So I think that replays up on the YouTube channel for free. So definitely check that out. I was going to ask you about that because how do you continue to innovate in a field like fine art that is so old and well established?
So innovation for innovation's sake always feels empty. The innovation needs to have a purpose, and I think if I hadn't come across these exceptional people and interacted with these underwater photographers and these professionals that interact with the natural world for the purpose of educating, inspiring, I may not have exposed myself to that sort of situation. So within my classical oil painting tradition, there's not really much innovation happening. The innovation is probably mostly happening on the chemicals front. The people who are making the paints. But even that remains very traditional. There's a saying in restoration that you don't trust anything if it hasn't been around for 100 years. And anything that's been created since 100 years hasn't been tested enough to know that that's going to last another 100 years. So within my field of painting, the innovation as far as the materials is pretty, it's stagnant in a way, not a negative stagnant, but it just doesn't need to go necessarily any further. The oils are the same from 200 years ago, the pigments are the same, and that gives you a sense of confidence to know that your paints are never going to fall apart. But when I've been exposed to these challenges of moving creatures, moving subjects, and being in a completely different environment, that's when I had to improvise. And I had to sort of improvise, but still based on stuff that I was seeing existed in different fields. So I had to go across to a completely different field and understand how archaeologists draw underwater. And so that sort of cross-contamination sort of idea of taking one idea and bringing it back into your field and using a bit of this and using a bit of that, that's where the innovation and the creativity sort of happens. Archaeologists draw underwater because basically they need to record a vision of the dig without all the extra rubbish flying around in the water, like sand and silt and debris. And so photography is actually a disadvantage in those situations, and drawing is actually an advantage. So I looked at how they did it and said, okay, I could draw underwater too. And then the advantage I saw drawing underwater as opposed to just taking photographs is that when I observe something moving in front of me, I record several different moments and then I make an amalgamation of that, and then I express that, thinking that I've just caught one particular frame. We don't work like that. Our eyes don't just make frames like a film strip. Whereas if I was taking a photograph, I'd have to click it at the right moment, or just machine gun it, just sort of click down and just shoot all hundreds of pictures. And even then, I'd have to use one image or another image, and it will just be one version of what I saw. And the advantage of doing it from life and using your eye is that you can actually amalgamate 2 or 3 different moments into one drawing. And that actually expresses your experience of having seen it, not more accurately, but more encompassing. I had no idea where they were going. I just basically took notes. It was like taking field notes, almost like a journalist, and then seeing what story I could make of this when I got home. And in the end, they were valuable. As you draw, you get better and better. Eventually, you'll start recognizing what they're doing. And then the drawing gets easier. You start predicting what they're going to do, and then you start adding a little bit more personality to the lines, a bit more detail. And then with all that, I brought that back to the studio, and with still some of that stuff fresh in my mind, I launched into an improvised painting that was trying to represent sort of the ideal projection of my experience for that whole week being underwater with the creatures. The process was really interesting. I did it in front of some students in Sweden when I was giving a workshop up there. I did the whole process in a different studio and invited the students down to come and see the different stages. They were either amazed or bewildered or confused by what I was doing, because some may have been able to see the link between what they were learning in a static manner and seeing how it could be applied to a moving world. Some others may have just not been interested, maybe, and like, well, it's not really what I want to do in the future. I'm more interested in doing still lives. But it was fun to get that interaction and see their feedback and the questions they had.
Well, I hope that they took away that, that creative constraints can often be a good thing. Like when you're painting up at high altitude, or when you're drawing underwater, it's a lot of creatives in many fields find that, having constraints like that actually boosts their creativity and enables them to do more than they otherwise could have done.
Yeah, I certainly find that, and I seek it out now, because I find that I, either through the excitement of confronting something new, I don't get lazy, and I really sort of rise to the challenge. And I have a friend of mine who paints in Philadelphia, and he wonderful painter. And it's funny, we send messages to each other occasionally, and we are the complete polar opposites of how we search out our subject. There's a Proustian idea that the hardest thing to do is see beauty in the familiar, being able to write or paint or sculpt or express something artistic and engaging from the mundane thing that you see every day just walking past your door. So my friend in Philadelphia, he makes masterpieces just rolling out of bed. I mean, some of his paintings are just a view out of the window, barely with one leg off the mattress, and he just creates these captivating ambiances of light coming through the window, or the touching the buildings opposite early morning. And I think he even did one painting sitting on the toilet. And here I am going to the polar regions, up a mountain, recently in February going to Antarctica, or swimming with orca in the water to draw. And it's almost that I'm incapable of drawing something in my neighborhood, and I have to go halfway across the planet to draw something. But it is, I guess he gets triggered and sparks his creativity from the most familiar things. I get sort of excited and riled up when I'm in places that really challenge me physically. Because I consider my practice as something my whole body sort of gets involved, almost like it's a sport, because I stand when I paint, I'm on site when I'm painting, I'm not taking a photograph and finding myself comfortably sitting at the studio. I have to go and meet my subject. But it is true that when you're under pressure, it also gives you blinkers, in a sense. You get very, very focused. But that's just me. As I'm hearing myself saying that out loud, I could imagine some people say, well, it's anything but blinkers. I just feel terrified that I'm going to die, so I can't concentrate to paint. So I don't know what it is that makes me focus so much in these relatively dangerous and somewhat challenging situations.
Yeah, I mean, having stakes is a very powerful way of motivating you to do something. But also, as you said with your friend in Philadelphia, the power of the creative every day. I mean, this is something that I think Mike Pell and Garrett Palm have talked about in previous episodes. Mike has the same walk to work, like a mile or so every single day, but he challenges himself to take a photo of something new on that walk every single day, and he posts that on his Instagram. And despite, New York City is it helps him out a little bit because it's such a vibrant and dynamic city.
Yeah.
But just having that challenge of seeking out sort of idiosyncrasies and unique things from each day is a really powerful way to keep your mind constantly ticking and observing your surroundings rather than just mindlessly being on your phone and walking down the street.
Thing is, with observation, you can't turn it off. It's not like you can put headphones in and you don't need to hear something, or you can block your nose so you can't smell stuff you're going past. With your eyes, you're constantly bombarded, and I find myself always being caught out by something. And then my particular thing is I always squint at something when I'm trying to decipher how I would paint it. So I'd be walking along and something will catch my eye. The next thing would be I squint. And then I sometimes sort of frame it with my hand to sort of make a little circle and see how that would look with a constraint around it, sort of separating into a single image. Sometimes to some people's bewilderment.
They're walking down the street. What is he doing?
I've had that. So on the bus, sometimes I'd be going along and someone thinks I'm looking at them and I'm just squinting. And they think, why is he looking at me so weird? What's going on? One time I was in the States. I was looking for little places to paint landscapes. I just started walking around this parking lot behind this little hut. There was some sort of offices. It was quite a rural area. And I had a little mirror with me too. I got a little black mirror and a little normal mirror. That also helps me. I won't go into it, but it helps me sort of decipher whether a view is going to be interesting or not. And I'm just standing there, and from the inside of the offices, they just look at this guy who's just sort of there, looking at a little device, and then looking around and doing this. I don't know whether they're more paranoid in America or something, but it's the only place I've had someone just walk out of the office and come out of the parking lot and say, "Excuse me, can I help you?" And you never know if that's passive aggressive. So usually I just take them at their word. It's like, "No, it's fine. You can't help me." And then they realize, oh, he didn't get it. Okay, I'm trying to say, what do you want? And actually, they were quite friendly. They came up and said, "Oh, what are you doing out here?" "Oh, hi. Yes, I'm a landscape painter. I'm just trying to work out a view through my little device here and stuff." And they were completely confused. They said, "Okay."
It does sound like quite a convincing ruse if you were doing something a little bit more nefarious.
Yeah, they were convinced. They was like, "Okay, he's not a threat. He'll go back in."
Yeah, the British accent is normally quite disarming for Americans.
Yeah.
So that helps.
He must be an astrophysicist or something. And I've always tried to help my friends in America. Look, English accents does not equate intelligence. Okay, but there's somehow that somewhere along the way that's somehow become this sort of stereotype. Obviously to the advantage of any British person, but I feel also to the great disadvantage of anyone in America getting fooled and swindled by someone who just has an English accent.
Being in the States right now, it happens every day. It's fantastic.
Yeah, that's why you're there.
Exactly. Yeah, no one takes me seriously in the UK. This is. You mentioned switching on and off the different senses. I remember you saying maybe in your talk in October about trying to include multiple senses in painting beyond just vision. How do you do that?
You can't turn these senses off. So just being in a place is going to be exposing yourself to different sounds, different smells, different temperatures, what you're walking on, the sounds that are happening under your feet, whether it's crunching on ice or going through a forest. These senses are taking in stuff regardless of whether you want to or not. And I think it really informs the process. And there's no particular way that I know, okay, I'm going to switch on this sense now. Okay, now I'm going to open up this sense. I just make sure that I'm in the elements. and confronted with as many things bombarding me, we've had to evolve to react to things just in a natural way, whether we're hunting or gathering or on a long trip to go from one place to another, as our nomadic ancestors were doing. You get informed on an unconscious level, I suppose, or subconscious level through the physical interaction of your environment. And I think that brings, to me, I feel it's essential to bring to the table, to try and make sure I'm getting the most out of the experience and putting the most into the painting. I haven't done a kind of a clear scientific analysis of what my painting looks like when I'm just sitting in a studio doing it from a photograph versus doing the same view sitting outside in the elements after having climbed up the side of a mountain or experiencing temperature changes and wind. But there must be something there, and I'm just trying to put I'm hedging my bets in a way that gets me to interact with as many different elements as possible, and I'm sure it can't do any harm.
Is that easy to teach in the classroom? I imagine there's a lot of preconceptions or misconceptions that they have when they're first starting out.
It's a good question. The more and more I've noticed in the student body of some of the schools I go to teach at, first they've been getting younger and younger, and the advent of social media and living through the screens and Instagram, that's become even more of a challenge to try and persuade students the value of seeing it, IRL. You have to now teach people to know what that means, to really experience this in real life, and it's become a thing. If anything else that IRL stands for is the fact that you have to describe in real life to people now, because there's so much stuff that's not in real life. You never had to have that adjective in a sense before. Well, the experience the students have when they get exposed to that is, I think a lot of them find it unexpected. They find it, is this really necessary? But can't I just do this, remotely? And then you get them to experience it, and they say, wow, yeah, that's really different. That was really cool. And they can't put their finger on it because they haven't worked out yet how to formulate what the experience is and how different it is to everything else. So I enjoy that. And that's why I like even taking people to do some outdoor drawing. In Sweden recently, I gave a course on taking the sketchbook out. So I'm a big fan of developing your sketchbook skills that a lot of people don't really do much of. That was really how I started. I was always sketching in sketchbooks before I pursued formal training, and it was great fun getting these people out. First, they were terrified. Like, how do you do this? How do you sit down and have a sketchbook on your knee and look in a completely different direction? And there's a lot of trepidation and fear and projection of difficulties and trying to give as many excuses to try and not do this. But then I find as soon as they jump in, they're fine.
So when you look back at when you were, their age starting out, can you recall an instance where your formal training sort of brushed up, awkwardly with the realities of being in location or in a studio?
I'd had a lot of experience drawing outside, but not painting outside. The biggest transition is as far as my training in Florence, the biggest transition people usually have is they get hyper trained indoors. So with still life, with drawing casts, drawing a figure under natural light, doing a portrait, all fixed, all stable, knowing exactly what the light's going to do. The first time I went outside to do some landscape painting. So it wasn't taught back then at the school. You just have to sort of deduce what you had to do outside from what you were training with inside. But there were a lot of gaps. There were a lot of things that didn't cross over. Plus, a lot of the colors you engage with, there's not much green indoors. You don't train your color senses to really develop that much green. Then you get outside, and that's 90% of what there is. And daylight, dealing with such large space, as opposed to just this convenient little vignette that you would have when you're indoors in the studio. That was probably the biggest, the hardest transition I found. And I was timid to the extent of not wanting to do a full color range painting when I first went out. I went out with a friend of mine who was my teacher as well. And he was a very, very professional landscape painter. And he just sort of casually started off his painting and looked at what he was doing. But I was I was doing a painting in black and white in the grisaille, which is a sort of a formal way of doing that transition from drawing to painting. I did it in grisaille, and he came over and looked at it a few times, like, yeah, but that shadow could never be that dark, or that could never be that light, considering all the different physical rules that he had learnt about light. And I was sort of shrugging my shoulders, like, yeah, I don't know. I was completely blinded and overwhelmed with everything that was out there for my first painting. But I just stuck to it. I love being outdoors anyway, so that wasn't a problem. Stuck to it, continued looking at his work, other people's work, and then eventually sort of started getting the hang of it. And I'll always remember that the director of the school was doing some landscape outings with colleagues, but he wouldn't really teach landscape painting. It was more of a hangout with the painters thing at the weekend. He had a great way of avoiding getting into the nitty-gritty of beginner painting. I said, can you give me a few tips? And I had obviously probably an awful landscape painting looking back on it. I said, can you give me some tips, and what am I doing wrong? And he just said, do 100 paintings, then come and talk to me. And some people could think like, oh, that's a bit mean. You could have, yeah. But the thing is, when you're that much drowning in ignorance, you just have to sort of dig yourself out of it far enough to then actually be able to engage in a meaningful conversation about it. Because before you get to a certain standard, not sort of a standard of excellence, but getting out of the confusion. There's really no point to even engage in a critique of that painting, because it'll just go over your head, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's excellent advice about constantly seeking to learn from the people who are really excellent at something and talking about it at a really high level, and you're just starting out. Is before you even take that course, or before you even ask that question, actually do the thing a bunch of times, because it will not only let you know that you do actually want to do it, because sometimes after your 50th painting you might go, actually I don't know if painting's for me, but also you teach yourself all the fundamentals that you can actually have a higher level conversation with people about it. That's
very true, because the good point you made, that if you do 50 and by that point you'll know if you like this or not. You don't want to waste someone's time with all these intricate philosophical questions of how do you paint a tree when it's not backlit or frontlit. Like, yeah, and the year following that, you'll find out that person's now interested in something completely different. And it also tells you if that person's really serious. Like, okay, go and do 100, come back. They've done 100, they come back, like, okay. I mean, they're not going to give up now after having done 100, I'm sure.
It's a self-vetting process, right? And
Yep.
Is there any other particularly good advice that you've learned from mentors or teachers over the years?
There was a teacher back here who did sort of classes for amateurs that my mum and my aunt used to go to. And as a kid, I used to join them. When I came back from Florence for some of the training, it was fun to hang out with them and do some drawing. And this guy was all about getting people to get out of their comfort zone and try something a little bit different. And I was there on one of the first classes, just doing a very, very careful drawing of this setup. In my early 20s, almost trying to sort of show off what I'd learned at the school. And then he came over and was like, yeah. It's cool what you're doing, but I know you can do this. In these classes, it'd be a great opportunity for you to actually just do something that you're not accustomed to. Try a different way of composing your page. Try a different way of setting up your point of interest and so on. And then on subsequent conversations, one thing he said, because of the training that was so rigorous in Florence. And that I think maybe he was concerned that sometimes people can get tunnel vision and just follow what the training has given you and forget what it is you want to do. He said to me, just never forget what it is you want to paint. However much training you get, however rigorous and repetitive the exercises are, and how proficient your technique is going to come, and how specialized you're aiming to be, never forget the reason why you started training, because it can be very easy sometimes to get distracted by the aesthetic that is being encouraged in the format of studying. either that aesthetic is chosen because of the facility to follow a certain regimented course, or it's simply a convenient way of being able to have a teacher and student to have a conversation about a subject. But it doesn't have to become your style. It doesn't have to become your subject of preference. And I think that's a really good message for people who do spend so much time in a specialized field in their training process.
And looking ahead, 20, 30 years, do you have any, ideas or role models of how you would like to mature as an artist?
Oh, yeah, that's always tricky. When I started, so the main breakaway sort of choices I made recently, since 2015, and exploring a little bit more this idea of science and art collaborating to contribute to messages of conservation, or was still retaining obviously my love for traditional painting, my love for representing the beauty of nature. I think the longer you work in a certain field, can happen sometimes that you start remembering, what it was that got you started, and you start doing this big loop back to some of the interests you had as a child, as an adolescent, and those interests come back and feed all the technique and skills that you've accumulated, and sort of give a sort of a new surge to what you like to do. Perhaps sometimes it's that the training takes so much out of you that you sort of get blinkered. You get sort of channeled into that world, and there's definitely a community that people feel very comfortable in. Traditional painting, classical painting. There's these contests. There's these prizes that get given out. Validation back and forth within that community, and everyone feels very comfortable in that. And I think it's very precious because that community is quite small, considering the imposing modern art market that sort of drowns out a lot of that. And in my particular field, I'm very much attached to that community, but at the same time, I do see a rising interest in what I do in connection with, I guess, public communication, and interacting the public that are not artists to engage with the subject matter. I think you can get caught in your specialty preaching to the choir, and I think there are some communities of artists, whether it's visual artists or whatever it is, not necessarily just in my community of painters, who are painting to satisfy other painters. Ultimately, we're not painting for painters, we're painting for non-painters. There are many more non-painters out there than painters. Working to get validation from painters is extremely precious and extremely valuable, because you're calibrating your expertise from the best people in the field. So obviously their opinion is usually the most valuable as far as understanding technique. But the opinion that's equally valuable is from the people who are not specialists, because you're trying to tap into raw emotion, instinctive emotion. I find that something that should be engaged with, and something I hope I do engage with more, especially with these opportunities to sort of mix in picture making with science and conservation subjects.
Totally agree. I think science communication is something that needs to be sort of taken back to the drawing board, because you could mail out a copy of the latest IPCC report on climate change to every household in the country, and no one would read it. So it's about, okay, how do we communicate these messages, for example, about climate change, in a more effective way that people can actually sort of see what they can do, and see what their actions are having on the planet. And filmmaking is a great way to do that. Fine art is a great way to do that. Photography can be very powerful, and I think that has been underutilized so far.
Well, I spoke to the head scientist of the Science Center in Monaco. I've spoken to him on different occasions, and recently on a project of illustration I was doing for a book that he's collaborating in. And he says he loves He loves engaging with artists because that's the communication tool that is the most accessible. And he says, we've got all this important data to put out, but it puts people to sleep. They see another piece of paper with words that reminds them of school. They feel like there's homework to be done. Throw in some engaging illustrations, some engaging drawings that actually break up the subject in slices and three-dimensional explanations. People getting involved in the whole stuff. That's why one of the illustrations that I've got back here, that's supposed to be describing the Mediterranean from 8 million years ago. I chose a sunset color scheme because I wanted the colors to be as attractive as possible, as engaging as possible, as opposed to midday sun where everything would be flat, predictable. Initially, you need to grab the eye of the person, then they'll start looking at the subject matter, and then hopefully that will lead them to reading the caption next to it, and then hopefully feed into being aware of what the main body of text is about. We're visual creatures.
Yeah, and in addition to not wanting to preach to the choir, you don't want to just completely tailor what you do to a field of, for example, climate scientists. You also don't want to preach in general because people don't respond very well to that. So if fine art is a fantastic way of doing that, because if you just show people, like with the work that you do on glaciers, like this is a painting from 1800 and this is a painting from 2020. This is the change in the landscape with how much the glaciers have receded. People can connect the dots and they can go, oh wow, that is a drastic impact that we're having. And this is what Blue Planet with David Attenborough did so well, is it didn't say like, oh, humans are really bad, look at what we're doing. It said, this is the state of our oceans right now. Look at it. And people made the connection and went, oh, wow, we need to change our habits regarding single-use plastic. And overnight in the UK, there was no more single-use plastic bags, and etc. So that is a super powerful way, but you don't want to do it in a way that people feel like, oh, I don't want to be told what to do, because as you say, it reminds them of school.
Yeah, it's a clever balance. It needs to be inferred. You need to sort of present what's happening, but not fill in the gaps. And that's also such an important thing about creating art. You have to leave enough gaps for the audience to jump in and participate in the conversation.
Hide the vegetables.
Yeah, that's right. It's an interesting parallel because the way you describe that reminds me of how I'm getting ready to teach this portrait workshop, and so often when I'm teaching people how to draw or paint either a face or still life, whatever it is, I remind them that they don't have to paint everything. We have this conditioning through photography and more precise lenses and almost microscopic imagery that makes people think that everything needs to be in the details. And also this sort of childlike sort of mindset that, I need to put in all the details because the more details I put in, the more points I'm going to get from people looking at it and saying, oh, look how skillful it is, look how much time they took. But I try and tell people, look, I'm just encouraging you I'm teaching you how to be a lazy painter. I want you to do the bare minimum and see what you can get away with. So that means sometimes squinting your eyes and seeing how the eye in the shadow side sort of disappears and you don't have to draw both eyelids. Put a dash and a little shape here, stand back, and people will understand that that's an eye. Because what else would be on that part? It was not going to be an ear. It's not going to be a nose. So everyone's kind of on your side. They'll look at a picture and they'll be able to fill in the gaps. And I think that's the parallel that I heard you talk about just now with how in filmmaking, to get a message across, you don't have to preach all the details. You just give a certain amount and then let the spectator fill in the gaps.
Exactly. And when it comes to lazy painting, we're sort of entering a renaissance period at the moment. We're on the cusp of an AI art-based future. I imagine with some of the younger students that you have, that's a big question that they have, and a frequent topic of conversation. I'd be interested in your take on that. How do you feel about it? Do you feel threatened? Do you feel excited? Do you feel like...
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to touch on AI, because a lot of people do see this in the news, and when they have a visual artist nearby, they would say, okay, well, so what's going to happen? You're going to be out of a job? So far, I haven't used it. I haven't used the image one. I've seen a lot of examples, and they're fascinating. I mean, just mind-boggling how how it harvests all this visual data to be able to put something together. So far, the hands are a bit dodgy. That's quite amusing, and it's humanizing almost to see how there's still a few things that you just can't get right, and you start retro-engineering that problem, and you start realizing, oh yeah, hands are peculiar, aren't they? You really have to understand what they are. It's not just a flat shape. They're obviously going to get better at that as they fill in all the gaps. I come from a tradition of painting that is particularly old, and therefore the books and research I've done to sort of educate myself through all the different painters over the past few centuries, it reminds me of it's almost word for word what painters were saying when photography turned up. The fear and the threat that painters had, oh my goodness, photography's here now, this is just going to do a snapshot, we're out of a job. And what it rather did was actually helped painting redefine itself, or rather define itself more clearly, define its own purpose more clearly. Before photography arrived, painting may have taken what it did for granted. It is what it is, and we don't have to understand or defend it or justify it or explain how it functions. Photography turned up, and all of a sudden, oh, okay, it was almost an opportunity to defend what painting does as opposed to photography. And it opened up two markets. People interested in photography, people interested in painting. With AI, I feel like it's going to be the same thing. People are just going to be interested in that kind of imagery, and others will just not necessarily gravitate towards it. That's from the audience point of view. But within the professional side, like the creator side, I have friends of mine who are way more up to date with what's going on and way more adventurous in engaging with it, and so I get all the genius nuggets from them and understand really how AI can be useful. The process to get to a result. So when let's imagine you're trying to invent a scene, you're in your sketchbook and okay, I want to do a couple of figures walking down a hill, and I want someone standing at a gate, and I want to create a cool dynamic sort of composition. And so you'd go through different iterations of that in the sketchbook, and you'd get to a result eventually. That's how I've done all my projects. But you will tend to be stuck in your own cycle. So there'll be results that you will do because of who you are and what you've experienced in life. And AI is particularly interesting in that aspect. Is it can help you explore options of composition that you would never have thought of. Beyond just the facility and the amount of versions it can give you before you get to your own version, it can also go down pathways that your brain would just never have thought of taking. And so one of my friends sees that as a very useful tool to get to a different version, but not necessarily to just do the picture and print it out and have it printed on a piece of paper and say, okay, I didn't even have to pull my paintbrushes out. So I think it's a healthy way of being able to see how it's not a threat, but rather just using it as a tool.
Yes, that seems to be the common thread. It's a way of streamlining processes that would otherwise be quite tedious and time consuming, and it enables you to do more of what you actually enjoy doing, and the proper creative side of things. Because AI is good at doing a lot of the laborious stuff, but not so much the really highly creative stuff that only really a human can do. So, AI can improve, audio, and it can take out uhs and ahs when you're recording a podcast or whatever, but it can't edit a feature film for you, because that is so intrinsically human. You have to really have an understanding of story and the pacing of things. So an AI you can immediately tell there's sort of an uncanny valley of it's not quite there. There's little things like having like 7 fingers on one hand in an AI generated piece of art. You're like, hang on, something's not quite right here. As it develops, it will improve, but I don't know if it will ever meet the gap where it's indistinguishable from a genuinely human piece of work. But I think there may be a point where we have like stamps of authenticity on things that say this is actually done by a human. Look at the physical paint strokes on it.
I just heard a brief segment out of a lecture that Stephen Fry was giving, and he was lamenting the presence of AI because he was pointing out that it's taking the joy out of the process. People are just sort of accelerating through the laborious stuff. It could be seen as laborious, but also some people might actually see the labor involved has a value. The process of going through those dead ends, those meanders, has a value in itself too that feeds the final product. So I think it can be really looked at from two different ways. It's interesting.
Are people going to exponentially become more productive, or will they reach a ceiling of like they're just going to use the extra time to faff on their phones as opposed to actually making more stuff? So it's like we will reach a ceiling where we can't actually create things any faster or sacrifice some level of quality there.
I've seen that happen with the practice of drawing and painting. Photography and taking pictures with your phone and stuff has become so popular that actually the novelty is now sitting down and sitting and drawing. That is now an enriching experience. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam a few years ago was now giving out paper pads and pencils and encouraging people instead of taking a snapshot and walking off. Here's a project. How about you sit down, free paper, free pencils, sit down and try and draw something that you like without the pressure of making a masterpiece. But the idea behind it was to try and get people to stay still a little longer.
Yeah, analog is becoming more popular than digital. It's having a resurgence. Vinyl LPs are becoming more popular than than Spotify. It's remarkable.
Whenever a new technology turns up and starts feeling uncannily close to human, what I find interesting in it, it reveals perhaps how unspecial humans actually are. There's this sort of pedestal that culturally humans have put themselves on the top benchmark. You see it through early religions, humans being at the center of the world and so on. You see it through animal behavior analysis and studies. And closer we get to understanding the intelligence levels of certain animals, and more animals start getting added to the list of their intelligence rivaling human intelligence, and now being able to see so-called intelligence through machines. People say, gosh, isn't it amazing how much more intelligent all these things are than we thought? It's like, yes, but perhaps you can see it the other way. Perhaps we're not as special as we've been told all these millennia. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It actually shows there's a lot of common ground, and we have a lot of common with all the other creatures on the planet. And perhaps it's this AI stuff is also, like I was saying, how photography threatened painters and forced them to define better what painting was. All these different steps of seeing intelligence happen in animals and now in AI is a great way of redefining what intelligence is, and also redefining what creativity is.
How would you define creativity in 2023? What's your take on it?
I always feel it's a strange word because I don't use it much in my own field. I don't say, "Oh, I'm being creative right now," or I really need to start being creative. So it's something that is just a process for me. My interaction with people when we're talking about creativity is there's a misconception. They feel that the creative part is creating something. The creating something is the labor of just getting through it and getting it done. Creativity really comes from, for me, the creativity comes from that spark of connecting several different fields that are not initially connected, and coming up with something new and innovative in a sense. Necessity is the mother of invention. I see a slight parallel with creativity too. I find boredom is, access to creativity. When you have nothing to do, when you see kids back in the day when kids would just have no toys and so on, they'd come up with something, get a cardboard box, they'd cut something out, make a spaceship, they're doing something. Creativity is a really tricky thing to access today, I feel, because of the constant distractions left and right. Finding a moment where you're just a little bit bored is where your brain starts ticking and thinking about other things, and that's where creativity starts for me. It's really, the creativity part is really just a small section of the process. It's really just the trampoline, just the stepping stone. if people understand that a little bit better, they won't be so intimidated by this large idea of creativity. People think, "Oh, I'm not creative. I can't make things. I can't invent things." You know, the expression of genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. That's how I see with creativity and making stuff. Creativity is really just the spark at the beginning, and that spark needs to happen and keep you passionate enough and have the endurance to finish off and just get through the labor of finishing off that painting or that sculpture or that project or that writing or that book. Creativity has to just come, is really the biggest creative part is really the beginning. The hardest part is actually keeping that energy through the whole project. I think that's where people usually fail. You need endurance. Creativity is the staying curious, being open to as many things as possible, open-minded, engaging with opinions that are not yours, but also just try and get bored a little bit more often.
Yeah, and done is better than perfect.
Definitely. I meet people who say, "Oh yeah, I can't. This is going to be difficult with me because I'm a perfectionist." And it's sort of an excuse that gets put forward because they know they'll never be able to make it because it'll never be perfect enough. And like you said, you're right. Just get it done rather than thinking it needs to be perfect.
What a note to end it on, and have this podcast be done. And we could talk about this for hours and hours and make it be perfect. But as you said, thank you so much, Toby, for chatting. I really appreciate your time and wisdom. And I think there's some really good takeaways for people in this episode. So I hope to see you again soon, be it at a creativity conference or something else. And
sure, yeah.
And your replays are up on YouTube, so check them out if you're listening and you want to learn more about Toby and check out his stuff online. It's phenomenal. And I'll see you in the next episode.